The morning sun filtered through the pines in Clearwater County, Montana, casting long shadows across the dirt road as Mark Daniels loaded his truck for his daily mail route. At 43, Mark had been delivering mail in this rural stretch for almost 15 years, long enough to know every pothole, every dog, and every resident by name. The late May air carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh rain from the previous night. A perfect morning by Montana standards. Should be an easy Friday, Mark said to himself, adjusting his postal service cap before climbing into his white mail truck. His route covered 38 miles of rural countryside, winding through forests and scattered homesteads where the residents were more likely to have wildlife visitors than human ones. After years on the job, Mark had encountered everything from curious deer to aggressive farm dogs. He'd developed a system, carrying dog treats for the friendly ones and a whistle for the not-so-friendly ones. Around noon, Mark pulled up to the Hendersons' property, a sprawling 5-acre homestead nestled against the edge of national forest. Land. The Hendersons had moved in just 6 months ago, fleeing city life in Seattle for the tranquility of rural Montana. Their gravel driveway stretched nearly a quarter-mile, requiring Mark to drive up rather than walk. As he approached the wooden mailbox with Henderson painted in careful green letters, Mark noticed something unusual in his peripheral vision. A tawny-colored shape moved between two junipers about 30 yards away. He slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. A bobcat, its spotted coat blending perfectly with the dappled sunlight through. The trees stared directly at him. In his 15 years on this route, Mark had glimpsed bobcats maybe 3 times, always at a distance, always fleeing at the sight of humans. This one wasn't running, it was watching, ears perked forward, tufted tail twitching slightly. Mark reached for his phone to take a photo. Beth from the post office would never believe this when the animal took a step toward the road. "Okay, you stay there, buddy, I'm just delivering mail," Mark said, as if the wild animal could understand him. He slid the Hendersons' package, a box from REI, probably more camping gear, into their oversized mailbox, then glanced back at the bobcat. It had moved closer, now only about 20 yards from the road, its muscular body tense. Mark put the truck in gear, deciding it was time to move on. As he accelerated, something unexpected happened. The bobcat moved too, not away into the forest, but alongside the road, keeping pace with the mail truck. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, watching the medium-sized predator loping alongside his vehicle like a farm dog chasing a car. He increased his speed to 15 miles per hour, then 20. The bobcat kept pace, its powerful limbs propelling it effortlessly through the underbrush parallel to the road. There was something almost playful about its movement, something that reminded Mark of the border collies that sometimes chased his truck in the valley. A curve in the road approached, and Mark expected the animal to veer off into the woods. Instead, it burst from the tree line directly onto the gravel road, now running a mere 10 feet behind his truck. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd read somewhere that bobcats rarely attacked humans, but rarely wasn't never, and this behavior was far from normal. He pressed the accelerator harder, hitting 30 miles per hour on the narrow country road. After about a quarter mile, the bobcat finally slowed and then stopped, standing in the middle of the road, watching as Mark's truck disappeared around the next bend. In his rearview mirror, Mark saw it sitting there, almost like it was memorizing his truck or waiting for something. "That was too weird," Mark said, reaching for his radio. He needed to call this in, not because of any immediate danger, but because something felt off about the encounter. Animals acting strangely often meant something was wrong, and in his years living in wild country, Mark had learned to pay attention to those signs. As he continued his route, the hair on the back of Mark's neck stood up every time he glanced in his mirrors. For the first time in years, the familiar forest around him felt unpredictable, as if something had shifted in the natural order of things. What Mark didn't know was that the Henderson property held the answer to the bobcat's unusual behavior, and that his simple mail route was about to become considerably more complicated. 3 days later, Mark approached the Henderson property with a new wariness. The weekend had passed without incident, but the memory of the Bobcat's strange behavior lingered. He'd mentioned it to his supervisor, who had shrugged it off as just Montana being Montana, and to his wife Laura, who had insisted he carry pepper spray. "It's probably nothing," he told himself, as he turned onto the Hendersons' long driveway, the spray canister heavy in his pocket. As he neared the house, he noticed Jessica Henderson standing beside the mailbox. Unusual, since most residents on his rural route rarely timed their mail collection so precisely. She waved him down with an urgency that made him stop the truck completely, rather than just hand the mail through the window. "Mark, right?" Jessica said, approaching his vehicle. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing work clothes, stained with what looked like garden soil. "That's me. Everything okay, Mrs. Henderson?" "Actually, no. We found something weird on our property yesterday, and I'm wondering if you've noticed anything unusual around here lately." Mark's stomach tightened, like a bobcat acting strangely. Jessica's eyes widened. "You've seen it too, the bobcat?" Mark nodded, cutting the engine. "Last Friday. It chased my truck for about a quarter mile. Never seen anything like it." Jessica's face paled slightly. "Would you mind coming to look at something? It'll just take a minute, and it might explain what you saw." Normally, Mark would politely decline. He had a schedule to keep and 23 more stops. But curiosity got the better of him. He radioed in that he'd be delayed at stop 15, then followed Jessica up the path toward their house. Instead of heading toward the front door, Jessica led him around the side of the property, where the Henderson land backed up against Forest Service property. A small shed stood about 50 yards from the main house, and beside it, Mark could see Jessica's husband, Michael, kneeling on the ground examining something. "Found something back here while clearing brush," Michael said by way of greeting, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. He was a tall man, with the soft hands of someone who'd worked in an office until recently. "Mike thinks someone was using our property before we bought it," Jessica explained. "Show him, honey." Michael led them behind the shed, where a tarp had been laid over something on the ground. He pulled it back to reveal what looked like a series of small cage-like structures, partially buried and overgrown with weeds. "They're animal pens," Michael said quietly, "but not for livestock." Mark crouched down for a closer look. The structures were small, maybe 3 feet by 2 feet, with heavy gauge wire. Some had padlocks still attached to rusted doors. "These are too small for dogs," Mark observed, "and not the right setup for chickens or rabbits." "Exactly," Michael said grimly. "We think they were for wild animals. Look at this." He pointed to something scratched into one of the metal frames. "BC3. BC," Jessica said. "Bobcat?" Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mild spring temperature. "You think someone was keeping bobcats here?" Michael nodded. "We found 4 of these pens, partially collapsed and grown over. Must have been here before the previous owners, maybe even before them. The real estate agent mentioned this property was vacant for nearly 2 years before the last family bought it. But why would someone keep bobcats?" Mark asked, though as the words left his mouth, he already knew some of the possibilities, none of them legal. "Black market pets, maybe," Michael said. "Or fur, or those awful exotic game ranches where people pay to hunt captive animals." Jessica hugged herself, looking back toward the tree line. "Whatever it was, we think that Bobcat might have been raised here, maybe even born in captivity. That would explain why it's not afraid of humans, why it follows vehicles." "It might be expecting food," Mark suggested. "If someone used to feed it from a vehicle." "That's what we were thinking," Michael agreed. "We called Fish and Wildlife yesterday. They're sending someone out tomorrow to investigate." "Did you see where the bobcat went after it followed you?" Jessica asked. Mark shook his head, lost sight of it after about a quarter mile down the road. The 3 stood in silence for a moment, looking at the abandoned pens, the forest around. Them seemed darker somehow, harboring old secrets. "I should get back to my route," Mark finally said, "but thanks for showing me this. It explains a lot." As he walked back to his truck, Mark felt the weight of this new knowledge. What had happened on this property was illegal, cruel, and potentially dangerous, not just for the local wildlife, but for the people who now lived in close proximity to an animal with a distorted relationship to humans. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He kept picturing the bobcat, confused and caught between worlds, not truly wild, but no longer captive. His mind raced with questions. How many animals had been kept there? What had happened to them? And most pressingly, was the bobcat dangerous? Next morning, Saturday, was Mark's day off. Instead of tackling the yard work he'd planned, he found himself driving back toward the Henderson property. He told Laura he just wanted to follow up to see if the wildlife officers had found anything. But truthfully, he felt responsible somehow, as if being one of the few people to witness the bobcat's unusual behavior connected him to its fate. As he pulled onto the main road leading to the Hendersons, he spotted a Montana fish, wildlife, and Park's truck parked on the shoulder about a mile from their driveway. Mark slowed, recognizing the conservation officer getting out of the vehicle, Rita Martinez, a woman he'd met a few times at community meetings. He pulled over and rolled. Down his window, "Officer Martinez." She turned, recognition crossing her face. "Mark Daniels, right? The mailman. That's me. I heard you were coming out to the Henderson place today. I'm the one who saw the bobcat acting strangely." Rita approached his truck, her expression serious. "Actually, I'm glad I ran into you. We found something this morning I think you should see." Officer Martinez led Mark through a dense patch of forest about half a mile from the Henderson property. They walked in silence, following what appeared to be a game trail winding between lodgepole pines and rocky outcroppings. "We got an anonymous tip last night," Rita finally said, as they navigated around a fallen tree. "Someone called the wildlife hotline, said they knew about the operation that used to run on the Henderson land." "Did they say who was behind it?" Mark asked, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "Not exactly, but they gave us directions to this location." She stopped and pointed ahead to what looked like a natural rock formation partially obscured by juniper bushes. "There it is." As they approached, Mark realized it wasn't just rocks. There was a small opening, a cave entrance no more than 3 feet high, well hidden unless you knew exactly where to look. "We need to be very quiet now," Rita whispered, pulling out a flashlight. "Follow me, but stay behind." Mark's heart pounded as he crouched down and followed the wildlife officer into the narrow opening. The cave widened slightly once they were inside, allowing them to stand in a hunched position. Rita's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a space about the size of a small bedroom. And there, nestled in the back corner on what looked like an old blanket, was the bobcat. Beside it, squirming and mewing softly, were 3 tiny kittens, their spotted coats still fuzzy, eyes barely open. "She's a mother," Mark whispered in awe. Rita nodded, keeping her light low to avoid startling the animals. The female bobcat watched them warily, but didn't move from her position, her body protectively curled around her offspring. "The anonymous caller said there were originally 4 bobcats kept in those pens," Rita explained quietly, as they backed slowly toward the entrance. 3 females and a male. When the operation was abandoned, the cages were left unlocked, but the animals had been in captivity so long they didn't go far. Once outside, they moved a good distance from the cave before continuing their conversation. "So she was raised in captivity, but managed to survive in the wild and even have kittens?" Mark asked. Rita nodded. "Bobcats are incredibly adaptable. Our theory is that she stayed close to the property because it was familiar territory. Probably hunted small game in the area, maybe even scavenged from the Hendersons' trash occasionally. And yes, somehow she either met a wild male bobcat or, more likely based on those kittens' appearance, one of the other released captives. And she chased my mail truck most likely because the people who kept her captive used vehicles to transport food. She probably associated the sound of engines with feeding time. When you drove up, she thought you might be bringing food." Mark shook his head, amazed at the animal's resilience. "What happens to them now?" "That's the complicated part," Rita sighed. "Normally we'd leave a wild mother and kittens alone, but these aren't fully wild animals, and they're too comfortable around humans, which could eventually become dangerous. You're not going to euthanize them? Mark asked, feeling a sudden protectiveness toward the small family. No, that's not the plan, Rita assured him. We've contacted a wildlife rehabilitation center in Missoula that specializes in native predators. They have experience with situations like this, animals with human imprinting that need to be taught how to be wild again. So they'll take them all? The mother and babies? Rita nodded. The rehab team will come tomorrow with proper equipment. The kittens are young enough that they can be fully rehabilitated and eventually released far from human settlement. The mother is more complicated. She may never be fully wild again, but the rehab center has secured permission to keep her permanently if necessary. They walked back toward their vehicles, the forest quiet around them, save for the occasional bird call. What about the people who did this? Mark asked as they reached the road. Will they face charges? The investigation is ongoing, Rita said. The operation appears to have been abandoned at least 3 years ago, based on the condition of those pens. But wildlife trafficking crimes don't have a statute of limitations in Montana, so if we identify the responsible parties, they will be prosecuted. Mark gazed back toward the forest, thinking about the Bobcat and her kittens, survivors of human cruelty now getting a second chance. I'd like to know when they're relocated, if that's possible, just to know they made it okay. Rita smiled. I can arrange that. You know, we always need volunteers to help transport wildlife to rehab facilities. If you're interested. 2 weeks later, Mark stood at the edge of a large enclosure at the Montana Wildlife Recovery Center, watching as a staff member checked on the Bobcat family. The kittens had already grown noticeably, their playful antics bringing smiles to everyone. Watching. The mother Bobcat, now named Helena after the mountain range where she was found, maintained her distance from the humans, but appeared healthy and calm in her new, spacious habitat. She's doing remarkably well, said Dr. Elaine Woodard, the center's director. All things considered, she's in excellent health. The kittens are thriving too. How long will they stay here? Mark asked, feeling privileged to witness this part of their journey. The kittens will remain for about 8 months, Dr. Woodard explained. We'll gradually reduce human contact and teach them to hunt live prey in controlled conditions. By next spring, they should be ready for release in the Cabinet Mountains wilderness, far from roads and human settlements. And Helena? Dr. Woodard smiled sadly. She'll stay with us. She's too habituated to humans to be safely released, but she'll have a good life here, with proper care and as much natural environment as we can provide. She'll also serve an important purpose. We can use her to help teach the public about wildlife trafficking and its consequences. As if understanding she was the topic of conversation, Helena looked directly at them from her perch on a fallen log, her tawny coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. There was still something wild and dignified in her gaze, despite everything humans had done to her. Mark thought about his mail route, how he'd driven past the Henderson property for years, never knowing what was happening there. He thought about how many other rural properties might harbor similar secrets, how many other wild animals might be suffering in silence. He made a decision then. Standing at the edge of that enclosure, he would become a volunteer for the wildlife center, helping with transportation and whatever else they needed. He would ask the post office to include wildlife trafficking information in their rural deliveries, and he would keep a closer eye on his route, watching for anything unusual that might signal an animal in distress. As Helena turned away to check on her kittens, Mark felt a connection to this small family that had survived against the odds. Their story would continue long after his brief involvement, the kittens growing strong in their wilderness home, Helena adapting to her role as an ambassador for her species. It wasn't the ending anyone would have chosen from the beginning, but it was a far better ending than the one that had seemed inevitable just a few weeks ago. On his next mail delivery to the Hendersons, Mark brought them a framed photo of Helena and her kittens, along with a thank you note from the Wildlife Center. Jessica immediately hung it in their living room. A reminder, she said, that sometimes the strangest encounters can lead to the most meaningful actions. Mark nodded, glancing out their window toward the forest, where a bobcat had once chased his mail truck like a dog, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately save 4 lives and change his own forever. Not an ending at all, he realized, but a beginning.